The Force is woven through every living thing in the Star Wars galaxy, not as metaphor, but as organizing principle. Every creature that breathes generates it. Every being moving through the galaxy's systems is connected to it. Reach into that connection, and a Jedi can feel what's coming before it arrives, sense an enemy's intent before the body executes it, orient toward any threat because the Force reflects everything that lives. Then a civilization crossed the void between galaxies, and the Force went silent. A void where living beings should have been, and the galaxy had no doctrine for any of it. You've never seen them in a Disney movie. A race from another galaxy attacked, one the Force couldn't even sense, and Disney erased them. They replaced this civilization with something called the Grisk, and by available engagement metrics, the audience greeted the substitution with complete silence. No anger, no rejection, simply nothing, because the substitution didn't register as a thought worth completing. The Yuuzhan Vong War spans 19 novels and kills Chewbacca in its opening novel. It collapses the New Republic's military doctrine, destroys Coruscant itself, and arrives at an ending so strange and precise it reads less like a military resolution than a literary one. In 2014, with the official Legends announcement, Lucasfilm made the documented decision to erase all of it. The case against that decision is specific, documented, and cumulative. Start at the beginning, and the beginning was outside the galaxy entirely. 21 years after the Battle of Yavin, the galaxy was healing. The Death Stars were scrap, the Emperor dead. Luke Skywalker had established his Jedi Praxeum on Yavin 4, training the first new generation of Force users since Palpatine's purge had nearly destroyed the Order entirely. Han Solo had settled down, as improbable as that sounds for a man of his background. And he and Leia had 3 children, twins Jacen and Jaina, and their youngest son Anakin, growing up in a galaxy that for the first time in living memory seemed to be choosing peace over war. Even the remnant of the old Imperial military, under Grand Admiral Pellaeon, had signed a peace accord with the New Republic. By every available measure, the worst was behind them. The Yuuzhan Vong had been preparing this invasion for decades, and they were already inside. An operative named Nom Anor had been embedded within the galaxy for years before the first open strike, moving through its political structures, seeding institutional chaos, identifying military vulnerabilities, and reporting back to a fleet still crossing the intergalactic dark. His work was the advanced groundwork of a civilization that measured conquest in generations. By the time the New Republic began receiving fragmentary intelligence about strange vessels near the Outer Rim, beings early reports designated only as the Far Outsiders, a name that captures the shape of the fear without grasping the scale of what was behind it, Nom Anor's groundwork was nearly complete. Their relentlessness had a history. An original homeworld called Yuuzhan'tar was gone, burned out by the wars they waged within it, stripped by a species so fundamentally oriented toward conquest that it had destroyed every resource it came from. Survivors loaded their entire civilization onto massive living world ships and began a transit through intergalactic space lasting generations, seeking a new galaxy to replace the one they had consumed. Every theological belief they carried, every biological weapon they had bred, every social hierarchy organizing their castes, all of it had been shaped across that long darkness into something harder and stranger than anything that had developed within a single galaxy's ecosystems. They arrived with every world ship loaded, not an invasion fleet on a military mission, but an entire species' surviving population with nowhere else to go. The franchise had always been aware of what lived outside its edges. Kamino, the ocean world where the clone army was bred, reportedly sits outside the main galactic disk. The Rim was never a firm boundary. The Yuuzhan Vong were the culmination of a concept embedded in the franchise's own geography since the prequel era. Something was always out there, and eventually it would come through. What came through announced itself at a planet called Cernpadal, a Vong biological weapon called the Dovin Basal, a gravity-manipulating organism bred for exactly this tactical application, was deployed to pull Cernpadal's moon out of its orbital path and bring it down onto the planet's surface. This was their preferred introduction, gravity itself weaponized, a world's own celestial body turned into the instrument of its obliteration, delivered as opening statement rather than last resort. In the chaos of that falling moon, Chewbacca died. Han Solo's oldest friend. The Wookiee warrior who had flown the Millennium Falcon through the Battle of Yavin, who had been at Han's side since before the rebellion, through every catastrophe the Empire could manufacture across decades of continuous warfare. Present in Star Wars from its very first frame, caught on Cernpedal with Han's son Anakin, cut off from escape as the moon descended, given one final choice. Destiny's Way looks back across Han's grief and renders it with a single line that carries the weight of everything that follows. But Chewie was gone, the first of the deaths that had struck him to the heart. That is the calibration Vector Prime established for everything that came after. The war hadn't officially begun, and one of the franchise's most beloved characters was already dead. Rules in place since 1977, voided in a single chapter. Then the Jedi reached into the Force to find their enemy, and found nothing. Living beings, breathing and bleeding and moving through the galaxy's systems with methodical, lethal purpose, who simply didn't register in the Force at all. Darkness at least has texture. The dark side announces itself as a presence a Jedi can orient toward, push against, counter. The Yuuzhan Vong appeared in the Force as pure absence, as if they had never been woven into the fabric of life. The final prophecy captures the operational collapse with a conditional that trails off into everything suddenly impossible. If the Jedi could feel the Yuuzhan Vong in the Force, they could. Every combat protocol the Order had developed over millennia assumed Force awareness as baseline. The ability to sense incoming attacks, read an opponent's intent before the body executes it, feel the shape of a battle before it fully develops. Against the Vong, all of it was gone. Jedi who had trained for decades found themselves in open combat with opponents they couldn't feel approaching, couldn't track, couldn't anticipate with tools the Order had spent generations refining. Some adapted. The Force might not reveal the Vong directly, but it still reflected the terror of those the Vong were killing, the suffering of worlds being consumed, the ripple effects of their passage through everything still connected to the living galaxy. Fighting blind meant learning to read those ripples rather than the source, a fundamental reorientation of combat doctrine that took years the New Republic didn't have, at a cost in Jedi lives the Order couldn't afford. The Vong's weapons compounded every layer of impossibility. Mechanical technology was a theological abomination in their religion, a prohibition so total their entire civilization had rebuilt itself around enslaved biological organisms as the only acceptable infrastructure. Every weapon, every vessel, every communicator, every piece of military architecture was grown from living things, bred across generations, shaped for specific functions through millennia of biological husbandry. A civilization expressing a completely alien metaphysics through every implement of war, one that viewed pain as worship and suffering as devotion, and had shaped its tools accordingly across the long dark of intergalactic transit. Their basic starfighter, the Coral Skipper, was a living vessel grown from coral, symbiotic with a Dovan basal at its core. When a missile approached, the Dovan basal generated a focused gravitational anomaly that swallowed the ordnance before impact, a miniature void into which incoming weapons disappeared. Every torpedo the New Republic's pilots fired, every weapon the galaxy's armed forces had spent decades perfecting, absorbed, one after another, by living organisms the size of a backpack, leaving pilots staring at coral skippers that had taken everything they had and were still closing. Von Dune crab armor was a living exoskeleton grown onto the warrior's body, resistant to lightsaber strikes and energy weapons. Fleet coordination ran through Yammosk war coordinators, massive hive mind organisms synchronizing entire battle groups through a biological network. Tactical intelligence adapting in real time through living tissue that couldn't be jammed, hacked, or disrupted by any electronic warfare doctrine the New Republic possessed. Communication ran through Villips, living creatures that reshaped themselves into the likeness of whoever they were connected to. Their world ships, which had carried their civilization across the intergalactic void, were structures the size of small moons, entirely organic, self-sustaining ecosystems housing hundreds of thousands of warriors. The warriors themselves underwent shaping, voluntary acts of devotion measured in suffering, in a civilization that viewed pain as worship and suffering as proof of divine favor. The shamed ones were those the Vong's own theology had declared worthless. Early in the war, they were a footnote. What happened to them later would matter more than most of the formal military engagements on record. The New Republic's institutional response was catastrophically inadequate. Darktide Onslaught records the Republic's official conclusion after the war's opening months. The New Republic is of the opinion that the Yuuzhan Vong threat has been eliminated. Every tactical success the Republic achieved was local and temporary, because the Vong's strategic pattern was consistent: advance, convert, destroy whatever the galaxy had built, begin replacing it with Vong growth. Ethor demonstrated the accounting. A world of extraordinary ecological beauty, regarded across the galaxy as sacred and irreplaceable. The Republic's forces won the military engagement there. As direct retaliation for that defeat, a Vong commander reportedly released a biological agent that poisoned Ethor's entire biosphere, killing every living thing on its surface and reducing an ecosystem millions of years in the making to ash. Winning a battle against the Yuuzhan Vong could cost you a planet. The galaxy hadn't understood that the ledger worked this way. The most conservative accounting places total casualties at over 300 trillion sentient beings, a figure that resists comprehension at any human scale. The destruction of Alderaan killed approximately 2 billion people. The Vong War eclipsed that benchmark by orders of magnitude across dozens of inhabited systems simultaneously. Every prior measure of civilizational catastrophe the franchise had established became irrelevant beside these numbers. Jedi died in proportion. The Vong had engineered a specific answer to the problem of Force users: the Voxen. Voxen were apex hunters, adapted specifically to track and kill Jedi, capable of sensing Force sensitives through their very presence in the living galaxy. A biological extinction mechanism, mass-produced from a single queen held on Merkur. The mission to Merkur was a strike team operation to reach that queen before she generated a full population. It succeeded. Anakin Solo, Han and Leia's youngest child, the boy Chewbacca had died saving at Cernpadal, didn't come back. His older brother Jacen survived, captured by the Vong and held under systematic torture, suffering engineered to fracture a Force user's philosophical foundations from the inside and rebuild them according to Vong theological priorities. For months, the Jedi had no confirmation Jacen was alive. What they eventually recovered was a young man who had survived by going to places inside himself that the Order's entire accumulated philosophy had no maps for, and who would carry that transformation as both burden and instrument for the rest of his life. Han Solo had lost his oldest friend and his youngest child. His surviving son had been broken and rebuilt in captivity by an enemy the Force couldn't perceive. His daughter Jaina flew combat missions against that same enemy without the Force protection the Order had always relied on. Coruscant fell next. For millennia, it had been the administrative and cultural heart of galactic civilization, where the Old Republic had governed, where the Jedi Temple had stood, where the New Republic had been rebuilding democratic governance from ruins. The Vong took it. Their ultimate objective was total biological and cultural replacement, not the occupier standard of installing new governance in an existing city, but the abolition of the city itself, its conversion into something recognizably Vong, as though the planet's prior history was an infection to be burned out. In the final hours of Coruscant's defense, Chief of State Borsk Felia made his final calculation. He detonated an explosive that killed himself and the Vong warriors who had come to take him prisoner, a bureaucrat's last accounting, executed with the precision of someone who understood exactly what the ledger required. The Vong renamed the planet Yuuzhan'tar, the name of their destroyed homeworld, the original world their civilization had come from and consumed. Renaming it was an act of grief expressed as conquest, the attempt to resurrect through territorial dominance a world already lost to their own internal wars. Vong forming began immediately. Biotechnology spread across the planet city's surface, dismantling its technological infrastructure, covering thousands of years of accumulated galactic history in organic Vong growth, consuming the Senate buildings and communications towers and the bones of everything built there, until the most recognizable world in the galaxy looked like a living wound wrapped around the skeleton of everything it had once been. Warmaster Tsavong La coordinated Vong military operations with ferocity that matched the scale of the losses, until Jaina Solo and Vergir killed him on Ebac 9, one of the war's rare victories with a specific name attached. The Shamed Ones had been watching all of it. Underground networks had formed within Vong-held territory. An insurgency from below, from the people the Vong's own theology had declared worthless, eating at the certainty that gave the warrior caste its purpose. It widened without alliance coordination, without deliberate cultivation, the Vong's social architecture generating its own undoing from the castes it had discarded. The Galactic Alliance had been following a thread for years through Vong theology and fragmentary records of their exodus. That thread led to something extraordinary in the unknown regions, a living planet called Zonama Sekot. Nothing else in the Star Wars galaxy quite matches it. Zonama Sekot possessed its own consciousness, aware of itself, capable of generating its own hyperspace field and moving through the galaxy under its own power and will. Scholars and Jedi tracing connections between Vong mythological texts and the planet's recorded history found an extraordinary convergence. Zonama Sekot was connected to the Vong's original homeworld, the first Yuuzhan'tar, the world their civilization had come from and destroyed. Renaming Coruscant hadn't been a random theological gesture. It was a civilization's grief, working itself out through the only idiom it understood, conquest, performing the resurrection of an origin it had annihilated. The lost world they were trying to recreate through war was alive, moving through the unknown regions, and had been there the entire time. Armed with that knowledge, the Galactic Alliance brought Zonama Sekot directly to the Vong fleet. Because their entire civilization rested on divine mandate, what struck first wasn't a military failure, but a spiritual one. The theological framework that sustained Vong willingness to fight shattered against Zonama Sekot's presence. A civilization that had structured its entire identity around loss, around the wound of a homeworld destroyed, suddenly confronted with the living proof that what they had killed wasn't entirely gone. According to accounts of the final engagement, their bioengineered weapons and vessels then began malfunctioning, behaving erratically in ways that conventional battle damage couldn't account for, the military disruption following from the spiritual collapse rather than preceding it. A civilization already fractured by the Shamed One's heresy from within, already exhausted by a war consuming worlds on both sides, couldn't absorb that signal and continue. The theological collapse outpaced any fleet action the Alliance could have managed alone. Surviving Vong were given refuge on Zonama Sekot, taken to the living world connected to their destroyed origin, and left there to rebuild under its conditions. The galaxy used a seed from their own homeworld to defeat them, and that seed became their future rather than their extinction. A civilization that had crossed an intergalactic void to replace a galaxy it had burned through found itself given, as its sentence, the home it no longer deserved. The war of incomprehensible scale resolved through something that functions less like a military outcome than a story's conscience. Connection over extermination, origin turned against its own obliterators, a people imprisoned by the last living fragment of everything they had destroyed. In 2014, Lucasfilm made the decision official. The expanded universe was declared non-canon. Every novel, every character arc, every named death and named battle across decades of storytelling was rebranded Legends and set aside. A new continuity was built from scratch to support Disney's theatrical and television output. The Yuuzhan Vong War, 19 novels, the most ambitious storyline the franchise had ever attempted, was erased in a single corporate announcement. What Disney offered as its extragalactic threat, in place of all that, was the Grisk. The audience generated zero documented engagement. Nothing, because the substitution didn't register as a thought worth completing. One comment captures the verdict. I don't care what Disney says isn't canon. They can decide what's canon when they make better movies. 974 likes. The Grisk, 0. The audience hasn't forgiven them. Subscribe for more stories like this.